Happy New Year, 2023, 2023. We are here. First video of the new year, and I'm going to jump right into this one because this is kind of a crazy thought or connection, whatever you want to call this. All right, so yesterday, Sunday, this was just on Sunday, January 1st, my colleague, the other pastor who I pastor Solid Rock Church with, he was on sabbatical the month of December. And so he came back, January, he's back. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, bro, do you want to preach on Sunday? I know you've been chilling. I do the most preaching at the church, but he is a good and capable preacher. But I asked him, did he want to preach? And he said, yeah, he did. And so I didn't know what he was going to talk about. I didn't care. That's my colleague. We've been pastoring together for years. I trust him. But he came with a message yesterday entitled, Be Ready. I wasn't expecting it. And he spoke from Matthew 24. And it was a really timely message. And succinctly, the point was that believers, he was reading Jesus's sort of Mount Olivet discourse, where he's describing the end times and what it'll be like. Now, depending on your sort of end times position, your eschatological position, if you're a preterist, full or partial, you will think that what Jesus was saying in Matthew 24 and Revelation, all that stuff has already happened. You know, if you have a different, that's the only one. The rest of the sort of end times positions where it's premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism, they kind of see Revelation and what Jesus was talking about as a future event, you know, sort of leading to a cataclysmic moment where the world is going to just face this significant supernatural war. And when Mike was talking yesterday, he was basically urging us to be ready, like to be ready, like talking about what Jesus was saying in Matthew 24 and so forth. And I really appreciate it. It was a really good practical message, especially because my church is in a series called the Supernatural Storyline of the Bible, where we're looking at the Bible also because a lot of the Bible, God is talking about the immaterial world, right? So if the material world is the world we live in, the earth and all of that, sky and all that. The immaterial world would be like heaven and sort of the supernatural world, right? So the immaterial world, the supernatural, spiritual world. I don't like using spiritual because people use spiritual for a lot of things that are really demonic. So I'm just using supernatural world or immaterial world. The physical world, what we live in, is what we see. And then there's supernatural world. And those worlds are always crossing the streams. I mean, they were created. They were created to kind of work together. And then sin came into the world and it changed some things. But when Mike was preaching that yesterday, I thought, you know, we need to be ready. And he was talking about being ready, focused on Christ and making sure we understand this stuff. But then I started thinking too, you know, on a supernatural worldview level, I think many Christians are also just not ready. Like we view so many things through the scientific lens that it's hard to appreciate the reality of what the Bible is saying. Like if you really look at what the Bible is teaching us, you know, going back to the Nephilim, which I'll talk about in a second, you see this collision between the supernatural world and the natural world, the material world that we live in and the immaterial world. And today this came, again, I've been in this series for a while, so my mind is thinking like this. But today I ran across a YouTube video which really prompted me to make this video. And the YouTube video it's a YouTube page called Slinging Stone. All right. I don't know much about them, so I'm not endorsing their theology. I know that they're Christian. I think they have more, they probably are a different sort of theological or eschatological way, think differently than I do. Because I've only looked at some of the thumbnails of other videos and the titles, and they're more Bible prophecy fulfilled. I'm not really one of those type of guys, so I'm not sure if I agree with them and everything. But I thought they did an interesting video today, and it was partly this story where a lot of people in national parks are going missing. And people are reporting seeing these giant, sort of what we would call Sasquatch, you know, like that kind of stuff. But people are reporting seeing these sort of giant human-like beings, and then they go missing. And this is true. Like, this isn't a conspiracy. I don't know what the reason is, but what I'm saying is actually true. And they document this in this video. But they talk about a guy named Andrew Dawson who was videotaping the top of a mountain, and you saw this figure, and they thought it was a human being, but it was clearly too big to be a human being. And then all of a sudden, he starts trying to film it, and he goes back to the location. The CIA is there, and they're instructing him to go away. And they make these. Then a month later, he makes this video saying it was all fake. But then he makes another video saying no, it wasn't fake, and then he's dead. So you would have to go to. I'm doing a disservice to the video, but essentially, this Sling and Stone YouTube video talking about Andrew Dawson, it really reminded me of something that I felt like, you know, I wanted to bring this up here. Because I think for many believers, particularly if you're from the sort of Reformed camp, like the Calvinism, Luther kind of camp, I think there's some good theology there. I know some people don't like it. I personally think there's good theology in that sphere of theology. In Reformed theology, I think there's a lot of good biblical theology there. But one thing that I think that a lot of people have done, particularly the Reformed theology, has sort of made theology material and have forgotten the immaterial world, right? There is a supernatural aspect to our world that we live in, that we experience and we're going to experience. From crazy stuff to things that we may not even recognize. Let me give you two biblical passages just to look at, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of this Nephilim, CIA, and Christianity thing, and one thought that we need to consider. When you go to Ephesians 6, Paul, and it's going to be cut off, but Paul says this in Ephesians 6:12. This is Bible. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, right? So he's saying it's not about humanity that we're wrestling with. You've heard me say this before, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers, right? These are all sort of supernatural beings and authority structures within the evil supernatural world. And he said, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So Paul is basically saying, yes, you're human beings. You live in the material world, but the war that you're fighting is not a war of tanks and bullets and laws and you know, a practical thing. This is a supernatural war, he's saying. Behind all the evil that you see, Paul is telling us, this is post-resurrection theology. Jesus is risen from the dead, and Paul is calling where we live a present darkness, right? So he's warning us that, like, listen, this is your reality. You may be Christian, and now you live in the material world. You live in but there's an immaterial reality to this. All right, we all know that one. But there's one more that's very subtle that is also reminding us that, hey, the immaterial, the supernatural, and the natural world, they are combined and they overlap significantly. Here's what Hebrews 13 verse 2 says. This is a crazy thought. Here's what it says: "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware." That's a crazy thought. Think about what it's saying. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. So, well, and you see this all through the Bible. I'm not going to, what I'm about to say now, I'm not going to really dive into this in this video, but if you notice in the Bible, all of the evil beings, spirits, deaf and mute spirits, unclean spirits, even Satan, right? They always have to go into a person. If you think about it, remember it says Satan entered Judas. You had in the Legion, the story where the pigs get sent, where the demons get sent in the 2,000 pigs, these unclean spirits, they're inside of a person, right? Satan has to enter into Judas, has to go inside. But when they appear on God's side, they appear in human form. Gabriel, when he comes to Zechariah and Mary, he's a straight up and down human being. The other angels that we see in the Bible, they appear in the Old Testament, angel of the Lord. Remember in Genesis 19 in Sodom and Gomorrah, it said they were two angels that came, and then Lot brought the men. But then when the men came, they said, "Give us the men who were with you. We want to have sex with them," right? So they saw men. So when the beings are on the side of God, they have the ability to appear in human form. But when they're not, they have to go inside of a person and possess them in that way. So here Hebrews 13 is saying, look, you live in the material world, but the stranger, the person who may be asking for money with the sign held up on the street, or the person who you may be talking to, God is saying you may be entertaining an angel. So that's a supernatural being in human form that you and I could actually be rude to and sin against. And so he's saying, don't neglect to show hospitality here, right? So these are realities. There's plenty of more verses that hit this. These are realities here. But I want to talk about really quickly what I think is when I watched this video by Sling and Stone. Shout out to them, Sling and Stone. Again, I don't know all their theology, so I'm not saying I agree with everything. I have no idea. But this video I thought was interesting about Andrew Dawson videos, and they do some other Bible prediction stuff like that. I didn't watch all their videos, but I thought what was interesting about this video was in the video they post credible articles and news clippings and writings of people uncovering the bones of giant human beings. Not paleontology where they're talking about dinosaurs, but they're uncovering these giant human beings, what we call the Nephilim. And so part of their video is the Nephilim people are trying to recover the Nephilim. Joe Rogan actually has 2 videos out right now. One he did yesterday and one that was released a couple hours ago about a guy who bought a piece of land where they had all the bones of woolly mammoth. I mean, he said thousands of bones of woolly mammoth, and some of them were dumped in the East River in New York City. It's like this crazy. And then you think about all the UFO sightings that people are talking about. And they're they're documentaries now. The government is finally releasing the reality of knowing that there has been some kind of what we would call, they call them, it's a different name now. I forgot what they call them, UAPs or something like that. But there's some, what we would normally call UFOs are now being, this stuff is going before Congress to talk about. They're not hiding this anymore, that there's something going on. So what's happening right now, and how should believers process all of this stuff? Well, I think, whenever I watch those UFO videos, they always talk like this. When they describe it, they say there was these lights, there was this thing, and then they say it moved outside of the laws of physics. Like there was propulsion, there was no propulsion. It just took off and it went in any direction it wanted. It kind of describes like how the seraphim act in front in as Ezekiel and Isaiah, where you see these beings before God. It says they don't turn right or left, but they just, it kind of talks like that, right? And I think there's something that we have to realize. We constantly are evaluating, I think, supernatural things from a scientific lens. So we look at everything from, even with the Bible, there are people who cannot imagine that in Genesis 6, angels became in human form and had sex with women. They can't imagine, like, how could that happen? Angels, but yet you accept, like, Jesus was fully God and fully man. You accept the virgin birth. Like, we have these supernatural things that we're comfortable with, and then things that we're not comfortable with, and we just dismiss as like lunacy or whatever it is, right? As believers in 2023, I think we need to kind of grow up a little bit. And I'm not saying that everything that everyone's saying is true, but we need to be more serious about the world that we live in. And, Strack and I on Cross-Examine, we talk a lot about being theological versus theological. Part of being theological is to see everything through the flesh and blood. It's the left, it's the right. But we live in a world, in a material world, that is invaded by the immaterial world all the time. Paul said we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, right? Is this really the left? Is it really the right? Or what's behind the left and the right, right? I think there's a way that I think we need to this is what I would say. I think many believers are on milk as it relates to the immaterial world. We don't take seriously. We look at things from what we're comfortable with. So we're comfortable with the virgin birth, but not this supernatural aspect. If you notice in the Old Testament, God never says these supernatural entities like necromancers and spiritists and mediums and all the stuff that we talk about, people who do tarot cards. The Bible talks about that stuff. In Acts 16, Paul and Barnabas are being followed by a girl who is taken over by a demon who they said was making money by predicting the future. Now, how do you make money unless your predictions are true, right? So there is a reality to the supernatural world that evil beings have some knowledge of what's going to come. They understand some things that we don't. I mean, if you think about all the demons who come to Jesus, they say, have you come to destroy us before the appointed time? Like they understood things that we don't. And I think sometimes, whether it's our theology or just the influence of the scientific age or the post-scientific age we live in, we're really milk in many ways about the supernatural world. There needs to be a balance. Yes, we have to test the spirits, as 1 John 4 tells us. We test prophecies, all those things. But we need to recognize and remember that we live in a supernatural versus natural world. We live in a material world that was created from the immaterial world. This is not what we're dealing with and what we're seeing. I think what we're seeing is all this stuff is crossing the streams. And it has to on one level, because if Revelation is right, if Revelation is true that eventually people are going to follow the beast. Now, it's symbolic apocalyptic language, right? We don't look at it and say there's going to be an actual dragon walking around. People are like, whoa, look at Puff the Magic Dragon. Wow, he's amazing. No, we're not talking about that, right? We're not talking about like some superheroes where it's going to be Lizard Man that's going to lead all these people against God. No. It's symbolic language, but it's giving a supernatural sort of description of what's happening in the material world. And there's going to be a rise of, and there is a rise of supernatural demonic things happening that people are being impressed with and going away from and looking at these things, and even down to morality. I'm saying this because I think, my church is really doing this series and we're really being impacted by this. We're calling it the supernatural storyline of the Bible. But when I talk to a lot of Christians, I think on one level, there's a lot of milk. And that's a dangerous thing. If you look at Hebrews 5, here's what he says in verse 12 and 13. He says this: For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. And then he says, for everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. Now, what he's saying there, he's talking about like maturity and obedience, right? But there are many Christians, many of you who are watching right now and who may watch this later, who have been Christians for a long time, but you are living in milk because you're so caught up in the material world and what's happening that you're not realizing that the immaterial world, the supernatural world, the spiritual world comes into our world all the time. All the time. Sometimes we see it clearly. Like when I was in India, I was like, Dad, this is crazy stuff happening. I went to India twice, in 04 and 06 for a few weeks, both times. I was like, Jack, stuff I just never saw in America. I'm not saying it doesn't happen here, but there is this, the world is like a curtain that just gets opened up and supernatural beings just slide in. Now, I personally believe this. I believe a lot of what we're seeing from these apparent Nephilim bones or these creatures that this guy Andrew Dawson saw, or UFO stuff where these things move without, I think a lot of that is the supernatural world is going to become more robust. Witchcraft and Wicca and all these things are on the rise, right? It's not just general morality, sexuality. Sure, those are supernatural entities behind it, but we're going to start seeing way more supernatural stuff. And it's important that if you're of the Christian tradition like I am, that you understand this is a reality. This is not like some cooped out like lunacy that other people are talking about. I'm not saying everything that everyone says is true, But there's truth in the supernatural aspect of the world that we live in. And it's happening. And it's happening more and more. And it has to. Because if revelation is right, what I was saying a few minutes ago, there's going to be a flux of supernatural powers displayed that will lead people to follow things that are not Christ. You see, when I was in India, I'm going to end with this story. When I was in India, we went to this village and we got surrounded. I thought we were going to get martyred. I thought we were going to get murdered because we came into this village where they were having this festival that was clearly demonic. It was satanic. And they surrounded us. And then we just were preaching the gospel and all this stuff. And we all thought we were going to die. I remember thinking, okay, this is it. I'm going to be martyred. I was engaged at the time. And I remember thinking, man, it wasn't the Lord's will that I marry my wife because I'm about to die because they're going to kill us. And then just being who I am, I said, well, they're going to remember that they killed me. That was the DC side of me, right? By God's grace, we got out of that. But at the end of while we were praying for people, this guy walks up. The whole crowd split open. It was like Jairus' daughter from Acts. This guy walks up and he says, look, I'm the leader of this village. He said, earlier today, 3 fishermen went out into the whatever. And there was one of them that was talking about this Jesus that you've been talking about. He said he brought more fish than we've ever seen back to the village. So there's something true about this Jesus. If you can heal my daughter, I will make this whole village believe in your God, in this Jesus. We lost it. We were like, oh my gosh. We were like, this is it. This is Acts. I mean, the village looked like this was insane to us, right? So we all start laying hands on this little girl, and then it gets really dark. And so the pastor who was with us was like, we got to go get into the van. We got to go. We're not safe. So we go in, and then one of the girls was really godly girl. She said, hey guys, I just want to ask you for forgiveness. I wasn't praying in faith. I didn't think the Lord was going to heal her. And I think she didn't get healed because of that. We were like, no, don't worry about it. The Lord doesn't need us. He could have healed her anyway. So we go to a village that I thought was really far away. And then someone says, hey, isn't that the same guy with the little girl? And I was like, no, there's no way. We drove for like 40 minutes. Sure enough, it was the same guy without the crowd this time. He asked us to pray again. Please. We start praying. We're praying now. We're like, all right, this is the pastor, Peter, John David. He was like, stop. He says to the little girl, she's rubbing the back of her leg, smiling. He says to the little girl, walk to me, right? She starts walking towards him. Then she walks back and she's rubbing the back of her legs. And she says, do your legs hurt? And she's big smile, shaking her head, no. We couldn't believe it. So we were like, oh my gosh, give her something. It's with this big bag of lollipops. We said, give her candy. So this dude gave her the whole bag. And me being from DC, I said, man, don't give her the whole bag, man. We want some of them joints. We gave her like 10 of them, right? I'm sorry. It wasn't a lot of sweets over there. I needed the sweets back then. We saw these things, right? And then one night I'm sitting with John David and I said, bro, why do you guys experience so much supernatural stuff? I said, in America, we don't see this that much. And he said, we have a saying in India that when Satan was cast out of heaven, he landed in India because there's so many gods, there's so much evil and darkness. And he didn't say this part, but I knew what he was getting at. He was basically saying that Jesus represents himself supernaturally to those people because he's showing that he's the true God versus all the gods that they supportedly worship, right? So Jesus will show up in a supernatural way, and the people that believe in him have like these sort of gospel experiences of bringing people back, all this stuff because of that, right? And that was one of my first tastes. This was 2004 when this happened. That was my first taste of being like, you know what, man, I need to take the supernatural world a little bit more serious, but not to be crazy and acting like, I'm not talking about the spirit got me laughing and I'm barking like a dog. Man, I don't believe none of that stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff I think is just whacked out. I think it's lowercase s, not capital S. But there is a sense where, I mean, have you ever asked the question, why do we need the Holy Spirit? That's a supernatural deposit that God said, I'm giving people who believe in me. What do we need that for? Why couldn't we just, I'm not going to answer that question now, but think about that. Why do we need a supernatural deposit? If for no other reason, because we live in a supernatural world and we have to fight in ways that are, The weapons of our warfare, all right, are not flesh and blood, but are supernatural. They can destroy and demolish strongholds. Second Corinthians 10, 3-5, right? I just think for believers, we have to be careful that we remember that even something like what he says in Hebrews, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, right? Because you're entertaining angels. I think what's happening with what I think the CIA is covering up, what I think the pursuit of the Nephilim, I mean, you have to go watch the Sling and Stone YouTube video. But what I think is being covered up is not scientific. I think it's supernatural, and they can't understand it. And as believers, I'm not saying we have to agree that every UFO is some kind of demon, but we have to understand that we don't live in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We live in the Jesus supernatural universe. And we don't live in the DC Comics universe. We live in the Jesus supernatural universe. And in that sense, there is a world where the curtain is getting bigger and bigger. And you and I, if you're of the Christian tradition, we have to be on our game and recognize, aha, these things do show up and they do be made manifest. Again, test the spirits, but there's a lot going on right now that I think a lot of us are just on milk, man. We're on milk. People can tell you a lot about who they vote for and why they vote that way, but they can't really break down sort of the supernatural reality that we live in, except just acknowledging angels and demons. It's much more deeper than that. And we need to be much more attentive and understanding, wow, this is a crazy world we live in, and be on our toes. So anyway, what do I know though? What do I know? I'm just a dude who made it to 2023 and wouldn't give a young girl a whole bag of lollipops. They wouldn't have done good for her anyway, because then she'd be looking like me in 2023. You know what I'm saying? But I think we need to take seriously not just what we believe about Christ, but what he says about the world that we live in. I could be wrong. I don't know. But anyway, first video of 2023. I plan on making this shorter. I would need to make some shorter videos for the gram, or not for the gram, for the algorithm. I need to make shorter videos. However, I'm just like, I gotta speak up about this one. But anyway, like and subscribe to the channel, man. Appreciate y'all. Still trying to get to Y2K. I thought we was going to get to 2,000 subs before January 1st, and then some people stopped following the video, the channel. Oh, what have I done? I'm glad you stopped following, because you're afraid. You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. I'm going to change it to you can't handle the tooth out this joint. All right, man. Appreciate y'all. Grace and peace. See y'all soon with another one. Happy New Year. Grateful for y'all, man. Appreciate you. Leave a comment in the comment section. Subscribe to the channel, man. And like this video. Jeez, all this work I do.